All right, so we're going to draw this chair. And of course it would fit on the paper, but it's a little too big, so I want to scale it down just a little bit. So this chair measures about 10 inches high by 7 inches wide. And if I scale it down so that it's now 7 inches high, it makes it about just under 5 inches wide. So what I typically like to do is just kind of make a mark on my paper. One that helps me keep it centered on the paper, but then I also know how tall I want it to be, and that goes from the top of the chair to the bottom of the foot, and then the sides. So that gives me a starting point. So then all I do is I'll sketch with pencil first, just because I want to make sure I get everything in there. I'm going to draw just a line about right there, which will be the bottom, where the foot meets the bottom of the chair, because I want to make sure that I don't go too far down. So anyway, so then I'll just sketch in really quick some of those lines. And just kind of keep paying attention to where things start and end. And if you get most of your shape in there, then it's a little bit easier to compare where things are. The side of this chair sits back about here. Maybe this one's out a little too far. But if I do it with pencil first, then I can always go back and change it. If I need to, then I'll go back in and I will do it with pen. I like to use the white eraser. And try really hard not to press too hard with your pencils, especially if you're using a mechanical pencil, because it's harder to erase. I think that goes a little further that way. Also pay attention to where your lines go. This is pretty parallel with the floor lines if you look at those. So that seat is going to sit something like that. And then here's our base. And that book comes out about there, about the same on the other side. And then this one is pretty straight on, so you're going to see really just the edges of it that way. Like that. And there is about our chair. So then what I want to do is I want to go back in, make sure I've got this the way I want it. And the thing about this too is you've got your pencil lines. You can keep your pencil lines in it even if you do your ink, because you can always go back after you've inked everything in and erase what's left. So now I go in with, actually let me get the right pen. Go in with a little bit thicker pen, and actually this is the one I want. Anyway, go back in and I just will give my shape. do my outline of all my pieces. And it's okay if you, because I'm going to add some shading and things in here, so if it's not perfect, it's okay. Mostly what we're looking for is just our outlines of each of all of the parts. And one of the things that I've learned along the way, if you haven't drawn like this, is to use your whole arm when you're doing lines, especially if you're doing a long line like this. Don't try to only move your hand. If you use your whole arm, you'll get a nice, better flowing line than if you just use your hand. So get these in here, and then what I'm going to go do is I'll go back in and I'll start shading. And I want to make sure that I've got all of the detail. So there's actually a line that comes down here, which is the stitching, the seam. And I want to make sure I get that on there. And then there's also this portion here that I want to make sure that I also account for that thickness. And I might do a little bit just of a broken line on here, just because I want to keep that in there. We don't see any of the stitching on this side. It pretty much ends there. There is stitching on the seat cushion that we can add in, but everything else is pretty smooth. There is a texture to this, and so as I've thought about this, I've thought that maybe using some pointillism just a little bit to give it some of that texture might be nice. And what that is just doing little dots to make your shading, your shadows. And so really, the closer the dots are together, the darker it'll be. And then the more you go out, the lighter it will be. But in thinking that that might give it a nice bit of a texture instead of trying to use lines. And you can use different size pens for this, depending on what you're working on. But as you can see that I can just kind of pull those points out, the dots, the lighter it is. The further apart they are, of course. So, that's just one way. There's other ways you could do this to give it to have it show some of that texture. But you can also see this isn't a perfectly straight line because it's stitched in that heavy fabric. And so even just pulling dots along that line will help give it that, it's not a tufted, but to give it that seam. And it will also help darken up that seam just a little bit. And as I look at my chair, it's not perfect. I think this one sits a little higher up. Mine's a little more of an egg shape. But in a quick drawing, that's kind of sometimes how it ends up. So, but I think the proportions are pretty much there as far as the chair itself. And the other thing I don't want to do is I don't want to add too much of the shading and things, because I want to render this a little bit later, and I want to use my colors on here. So really I just want to identify where my dark portions are and where my light portions are, where my highlights are. So when you look at this, the darkest portions are here. So our light source is up here, up the upper right. So that's where our light source is coming from, and probably just back a little bit because you do get some shading here. But then this side of the chair is where where more of our shadowing is going to be. And we also want to make sure that we give it that curve. So as we put our shading in, we want to make sure that it's not all one tone, that we have darks to lights, and that will help give it that rounded shape. So what I'd probably do too a little bit here is I think I'll just give it a little bit of some shading, some light dots here, so that I know that that's kind of this has got a little bit of shading on it, and where that kind of stops and starts. And this will help me when it'll give me some texture, but it also help me when I go to render it. I'll remember that this is also a little bit darker area. So I give it some of those dots. Really simple. It fades out down here. And I want to, where there's a highlight on the curve of this chair, like right here on the top, there's a light over here and light here. I want to make sure that I don't really put anything in those areas, so that if I want to keep that super light when I go back into paint and I render it, I'll have that integrity there. So I might even just pull these dots away from that edge a little bit, so that I have that reflective light there, and I still have my shading that would be in here. But can you see how those dots would give it some of that texture? You can tell this fabric's probably a felt or a heavy pattern. It might even be a wool blend of something. So it's got that kind of a natural texture to it. And anyway, so I would just keep working on adding some of those dots in there. We don't have any. There's a little bit of reflective light that you'll see just barely on the back side of this. It won't be as light as what you would see on these areas, but it's not as dark as you would see on these shaded areas, if that makes any sense. And then of course at the right under here you have reflective light here too. So you want to make sure that you keep those areas clear, so that you can go back in, you can only add just a little bit of color. And then these areas where there's more shading, you can make those dots just a little bit darker, maybe a little more dense together. But that's just some of the ways to do it. And I will finish up the sketch so you don't have to watch me do the whole thing, and bring it to class so that you can see the finished product. Thanks.